Welcome to Army National Guard Combat Field Studies Digital Edition. I'm Sergeant Aaron Heft. Today we're marking the anniversary of a historic event with the Wisconsin Army National Guard's Major Brian Faltinson. And we'll be talking about the 32nd Division's mobilization to Fort Lewis, Washington in support of U.S. operations in Germany, and what that mobilization teaches modern leaders today in our force. Major Faltinson, thanks for coming back on with us.
Hey, it's great to be with you, Aaron.
So let's start with a situation that's quite familiar to the National Guard today. In 1945, the 32nd Infantry Division returns home from the Pacific and begins that demobilization process, and more importantly, the reorganization of the National Guard of Wisconsin. Can you tell us a little bit about that time period and what it meant for the soldiers in the Wisconsin Guard?
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. The 32nd Division, like every other National Guard division in World War II, was completely discharged from the Army at the end of World War II, and each state had to rebuild its National Guard force in its state so it can do its state and federal missions. The 32nd was starting to be rebuilt entirely within the state of Wisconsin in 1947 and 48, and eventually was probably about to full strength by 1949, and would train throughout the 1950s. Kind of an important part about that is there is a strong cadre within the division of very experienced senior NCOs and officers who had fought with the division or in other Army units in World War II, and were now kind of formed a solid cadre to help form the division, because most of the brand new soldiers had never been in the military before, and so there is very important to bring them up to speed and then bring them back into, so you can get a quality military unit that could go out there and support the United States Army or be prepared in the state of Wisconsin in case there is an emergency.
Yeah, I think that's a situation that's very familiar to our force today. As you know, operations in Iraq and Afghanistan wind down, it's really those experienced combat NCOs and officers who are shaping the force of new soldiers coming in, fresh from basic training in AIT. And, despite that drawdown from operational assignments, we as a Guard force still have to be ready and prepared to deploy at a moment's notice, much like the Minnesota Guard did not that long ago in Kabul.
So the National Guard as a whole did contribute soldiers and airmen to the Korean War. The Wisconsin National Guard was not involved in that operation. But as the 1950s moved into the 1960s, there were 7 of the 27 National Guard divisions that were considered high priority units. One of those was the 32nd Infantry Division. And what a high priority unit meant to the National Guard and the Department of Defense was those are the first National Guard divisions that would be called up to augment the United States Army in an operation anywhere in the world. It would take some time to get that unit ready completely to deploy, but it was they knew that they would be called first, and their training as a result, they would receive a little more equipment and had a higher authorized strength. They had some more resources to prepare their units to deploy. The 32nd Division, coming out of 1960 to 1961, was probably fully reconstituted and as a unit that could fully embrace that it was a high operational or high priority unit within the National Guard.
So the 1960s, we know that's a pretty turbulent time, politically in the United States and, emotionally for a lot of the population. So what was it like for National Guardsmen from Wisconsin during that time period, being at such a high state of operational readiness and being prepared to deploy at any moment?
At the time, units did not drill on drill weekends. It was one night a week. It would be a drill period. So as every week, a soldier would attend a drill. And then also there was your annual training periods. And they were constant evaluations by active duty soldiers coming in to evaluate Guard units to ensure their readiness. And coming out of the 1961 annual training, the 32nd Division had multiple units that had achieved a high level of readiness.
So Major Faltinson, what happens in Europe at this time that kind of changes things for the op tempo of the Wisconsin National Guard?
In 1961 was a very hot period in the Cold War, as in there's a lot of tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. There was some face-offs that had people thought coming out of World War II maybe go to a hot war or a conventional war or even a nuclear war. People were very, very scared at the time about that. It was a real thought that again, there had been a war in World War I and then World War II, and then thinking maybe 20 years later, we're going to have another one. So there's very high tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and they came to a head in 1961 in Berlin. Berlin was occupied by the four major powers of the Soviet Union, France, England, and the United States to kind of occupy and manage the city. And with the Soviet Union saying in 1961 that, hey, we're going to stop that and we're going to block all access to Berlin from the other three powers. But then also, all of the East Germans were trying to escape communism and were using Berlin as their route to try to escape that. So it was coming to a head, and then there's actually American tanks and Soviet tanks facing each other, seeing who would, waiting for the order to pull the trigger and start a war. So that was the stage in like June and July and August of 1961. Very tense. And President Kennedy, he wanted to ramp up U.S. forces as a show of force to hopefully deter a war. He didn't want to fight the Soviet Union. He wanted to deter a conflict with strength from the active duty and bringing over some American active duty forces to Europe potentially. But the key point of that is those units who would leave the United States from active duty would be National Guard units filling in, and they would have been that next line of units to go over to Europe in case a war actually happened. So that's where the 32nd comes in, and then the 49th Armored Division of Texas come in. Those are the two divisions that were tapped by President Kennedy to be mobilized as backfill units for the 4th Infantry Division at Fort Lewis and the 1st Armored Division at Fort Hood. And those active duty units were totally staged to fly to Europe immediately, and then the 32nd's role and the 49th Armored Division from Texas, their role was to be prepared to be a fully operational and integrated Army division with the active duty.
Wow, so all that extra training and all that rebuilding post-World War II is really going to pay off in that time frame then. So what is that mobilization, what does that call to duty look like for the Wisconsin Guard?
So they come out of annual training in June and July, and they receive very high marks. And then President Kennedy starts having units all over the nation do extra drills to help get ready, and then started to identify units to potentially be called up. Besides those two divisions, there was like 260 individual guard units at the company and battalion level that were used to augment other parts of the U.S. Army. And, basically 39 states contributed forces to this mobilization, about nearly 250,000 soldiers. And so in October, the 32nd Division moved out to Fort Lewis, Washington, which was the home base of the 4th Division at the time. And they started to arrive there, train, get some replacement equipment, and then integrate about 3,500 Army reservists, because the Wisconsin Guard was authorized about 10,000 soldiers, and they had that, but the division was authorized about 14,000 soldiers. And they designed it that way to be filled with an Army Reserve filler to bring it up to war fighting strength. And those troops had to be then integrated in the first couple months while they were in Fort Lewis.
That sounds like a pretty incredible process to pull them together and get them mobilized, their ranks filled out, and get them shipped off to Fort Lewis. So what happens once they get there? What type of training do they go through? What type of activities do they perform for the Army?
So back up just a half a minute. World War I was 40 years prior to this. World War II was 20 years prior to this. There's actual stories of you have fathers or grandfathers deploying for World War I with the 32nd Division, fathers deploying to World War II at the 32nd Division, and now you have grandsons deploying in 1961 with the 32nd Division. So it's getting to be a routine thing in the communities within the state. There's a Life magazine cover of showing the 32nd's getting called up again. And there are scenes throughout the state of soldiers getting on trains, departing their home armories, saying goodbye to their families, and then marching off for the third time in 40 to 50 years to be ready to defend our nation, not knowing how that would turn out. So that's an important part of the National Guard, and it is as the most community-oriented force that we have in the U.S. Army, and that's what makes the Guard powerful and makes it special. So when they got to Fort Lewis, they found a bunch of World War II barracks that hadn't been used for about 10 years, and they had to repair those. They had to get everything ready to go. Basically, like any other deployment that we're all experienced with, is you move somewhere, things go badly, it doesn't go well, you got to integrate into new processes. So it's very painful in that respect. And the Army was not ready to integrate National Guard soldiers into its force structure, and those processes were exposed and then were worked out later on. But they eventually got all integrated in physicals and immunizations and all that other stuff, and all these new troops integrated in. And then they started doing squad training, platoon training, company training, working their way up into battalion training, or a battle group at the time, and higher level training, integrated with combat, all integrated, or combined arms, I should say. They had armor, they had artillery, they integrated air operations, they integrated airlift capability. They conducted operations in a mock nuclear environment, because that's the way they thought it would be back then. The Guard, or the 32nd Division, actually had an artillery battery that could fire nuclear-tipped missiles, and they started to integrate those operations into their training. And so by March of 1962, they had gone through several brigade, or about 2,000 to 3,000 troop exercises, and then culminating in a division-wide exercise that was essentially part of the largest active duty training exercise conducted after World War II.
So a process of building up from squad to platoon to company and on up level, training exercises, integrated operations between combined arms forces, and even some CBRN activities. I think that kind of reminds me of a lot of the operations we've got going on in non-combat environment today. Very similar training model and method of preparing. So how long does Wisconsin stay there, and what does that mean for their readiness when they do eventually redeploy back home?
So the unit started to head back to Wisconsin in August of 1962. The tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States had dissipated going into 1962, but the 32nd was on duty for a year approximately, and during that time they became part of the Strategic Army Reserve, or STRAC. And a STRAC unit then was defined as a unit that could deploy anywhere in the world on relatively short notice to deal with what are called small brush fire wars. And it wouldn't be the big major conventional war like in Europe or whatever, but what if a side mission or a side hotspot started somewhere in the world to distract the United States from a larger strategic goal? They had to have forces to be able to go deal with that at a moment's notice, and that's what STRAC units were for. So from basically March through March through August of 1962, the Wisconsin National Guard's 32nd Division was in a STRAC status. It had 300 soldiers absolutely ready to go anywhere in the world in a couple hours' notice, with the rest of the division following very shortly, or as fast as the equipment could be moved to anywhere in the world. So there was probably about 8 units total in the Army that could conduct this. And these are units like the 82nd Airborne, the 101st 101st Division, the 1st Division. So the 32nd was right in there with those units for this period of time. And then when the 32nd was then demobilized at home, they went back to their regular lives, and the strat status went away after that. But you had a lot of very experienced, very well-trained soldiers to create a cadre within the Wisconsin National Guard.
So when these Wisconsin National Guardsmen are called up for the Berlin crisis, what does that mean for their personal lives, for their families?
This was actually a pretty disruptive deployment for members of the Wisconsin National Guard. It was not like in World War I and World War II where the National Guard of the entire country was mobilized. It was basically mostly 2 states with, smatterings throughout the rest of the country. But so you have 10,000 soldiers that depart the state, and they have jobs, and they have families, and they have careers, they have mortgages to pay, and there's a lot of resources in place now for when a soldier deploys and to assist the families, and certainly the pay and the benefits are far superior now than they were in 1961. So there's a lot of hardship with regard to people didn't always have a job to come back to, and there's some great job protections now in place. And there's some financial resources in place for those who are struggling with the loss of income. So there were some hard lessons learned, and we today as soldiers benefit from these hard lessons that these soldiers had to experience. So that's a good thing that, if we're going to be a more operational force, that our force is taken care of.
Yeah, I think for a lot of us in retrospect, looking back at the Cold War, now we know that there was no major nuclear conflict between Russia and the United States. We know no major conflict broke out in Europe, but at the time that was a very real fear. And I think it's the same situation for a lot of our units deployed today. I think if we look at that task force from the Minnesota Army National Guard that not that long ago had to deploy alongside many of those units you mentioned, to Kabul and help out with the situation there. I think this is an experience that a lot of us in the Guard who are on non-combat operations can really learn from. So, I mean, going from that, as a historian, looking back at the Berlin crisis and looking back at the deployment of the Wisconsin National Guard, what can a modern soldier today take away from that, especially somebody who's already slated for a deployment to somewhere like Kuwait or Europe?
The key thing to that is, you always need to be ready to perform your mission. And over the past year and a half has never been more true within the entire National Guard in this nation. We as soldiers have to be ready to stand up for any mission, whether that is COVID or civil disturbance or whatever type of mission comes along, support at the Capitol, support for missions overseas, support for no-notice mission in Kabul and Afghanistan. Our soldiers are fully integrated as operational reserves now, relied upon and needed by the U.S. Army to help them fulfill their mission. When with regard to that, is the Berlin crisis is kind of a key point in the strategic/operational reserve of the National Guard, because this incident was the first time that a National Guard unit was mobilized as a tool in foreign policy. It was used as to try to leverage or gain something out of the opponent or the Soviet Union without actually using arms or using a conflict. President Kennedy was asked why he mobilized the 32nd Division, and he said, "I did not mobilize the 32nd to fight a war. I mobilized them in order to prevent a war." So it was a very key, important use of the military as a tool to help de-escalate what probably would have been a very destructive conventional and possibly nuclear war in Europe at the time.
I think those are some great points, sir. And I think it just kind of reinforces why it's so important as soldiers to look back at our past to kind of shape the way we prepare and respond to tasks and missions in the future. So if I'm a soldier in the Army National Guard and I want to know more about the 32nd Division's mobilization and deployment to the Berlin crisis, where might I find more about this topic?
So the Wisconsin National Guard, we're putting out some pretty good historical product on this mobilization, and the best way to get at it is through the Wisconsin National Guard Facebook page.
Major Faltinson, thanks for coming back out on the program today and talking with us about the Berlin crisis. We appreciate you coming out and taking the time to speak with us.
Thanks, Sergeant Heft. It's always great to come here to talk about National Guard history and the history of the 32nd Division of Wisconsin.
Outstanding, sir. Well, Major Faltinson, thank you for coming out and talking with us about this important subject. For our listeners, thanks for tuning in. And if you're looking for more historical topics or training activities in the Army National Guard, feel free to take a look at Leaders Recon on Facebook or check us out on Instagram at ARNG_leader_development.